Hello, everybody. This is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. This is the latest in our series of exploratory discussions with people of various philosophical perspectives. And I am really thrilled tonight to have, what do you go by, Youth Resist? Or, I mean, what should I call you for this?
Youth Resist, Chris Rhodes, either.
Chris Rhodes. I'm thrilled to have Chris Rhodes. We think we may have El Spartan, but every time he turns on his microphones, it sounds like a space monster has taken over control. So I'm not sure what we're going to get from El Spartan.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out that now. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't sound happy. We'll go on, and maybe he'll turn back into a human. For those who don't know me, I'm Jeffrey Williams. I'm pretty much just a simple semi-literate biker who lives under a bridge, and possibly the subject of an international manhunt. I have to check on that later. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am technically a layman with an interest in philosophy. I have a Twitter account under the handle @YouthResist, and I'm interested in many different fields of philosophy. I'm particularly interested in what would be considered metaphysics, philosophy of nature, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, things of that nature. Although specifically pertaining to metaphysics, I am interested in epistemology, what we can know about metaphysics, and that's what I'm here to describe today.
Right. El Spartan, have you returned to human form?
Trying to. It does not. The computer is terrible.
Well, we'll go on. No, I'm worried about him. I think a monster has him abducted.
A demon has taken over my body. Yeah.
Could you hold on one second?
Proof of Christianity.
Yeah, we'll go on. You and I, Chris, had a very lengthy discussion some months back, stemming from, of all funny things, WLC and his Kalam argument, which I've been engaged in again for the last few days. I don't know why I get dragged into that. Anyway, it turned into a very long and very interesting discussion having to do with, is there any ground to metaphysics and how do we know things? And we had some differences on epistemology. In fact, on my blog is a lengthy response to your last questions because it just was too cumbersome on Twitter. Later on, I'll link to that response down in the
I remember that. Yeah, that was a while ago.
Oh yeah, it was. But anyway, you said you've changed your opinion on certain things since then, and I think the way to start out is, why don't you kind of go over where we were and how you've changed, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, that sounds good. So in specific reference to this discussion that we had then and we're continuing now, my position was generally, well, we were talking about things like perception, realism, representationalism, and things of that nature. And so my position then, I'd consider myself a sort of direct realist or a naive realist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I did not have much difficulty simply adhering to the view that we see things as they are, and I rejected any sort of Kantianism, transcendental idealism, anything of that sort. Simply that there's a material world out there that we see directly, that we experience directly, and that was pretty much the end of it. And now I am more open to a sort of idealistic picture of the world and our interaction with it. That's the world that we interact with. We might interact with it directly per se, but what we directly interact with is not necessarily material objects that exist independently of us. At the moment, I am more sympathetic to a sort of Schopenhauerian view, sort of a dual aspect monism, where there is a fundamental will to reality, or considering that I'm flexible at this point, some sort of fundamental mental aspect to reality. and then the external representation, which is what we see, what we encounter, what we interact with, right? And this would be, rather than a dualistic philosophy, this would be a sort of dual aspect or a dual side monism. Oh, it sounds like my voice is echoing through JC's microphone right now. Oh, it's better, but right. So that's how I understand things now, right? That we do interact with a reality that is not simply the Kantian distinction, right? I still disagree with or dissent from a transcendental idealism, right? The idea of an object, the thing in itself, our experience of that initiating a sort of sense experience which is not accurately reflected of the 12 categories, things like this, I'd still move myself away from. However, I would not be in disagreement with another idealistic philosophy which had some sort of discrepancy between fundamental reality and what we experience. So yeah, there's definitely a significant shift there, although I still think there's enough meaningful differences between what I believe and what I'm pretty sure you hold to at this point for there to be fruitful discussion. So
yeah, I think so. Let me go back to something you said. It was in connection with Schopenhauer, I believe, that you believe in some sort of a consciousness or mentality in fundamental reality. Did I understand that right?
yes, and I would like to clarify now that I am flexible with this, right? Like I could see possibly one of the other German idealists wooing me on this concept that maybe it is self-conscious that is fundamental, but right now I think that a sort of irrational, mindless impulse,
right,
or drive is fundamental to reality, right? And so yeah, that's what I hold to now.
Yeah, that's more what Schopenhauer had in mind. He didn't, his big move from Kant was he kept the epistemology the same, but inverted will. For Kant, will was that transcendental connection to God, and that's what justified reason. I mean, he based everything on reason. How do we know reason isn't an error? Well, for Kant, he justified it through will. Will is the elemental driving force of everything. He saw that as the fount of pure reason and God. Schopenhauer took will and inverted it. He said there is nothing outside of physical reality. There is will, and will inheres in everything, but it's not conscious. It is blind, and it has no ultimate goal. It just simply wills itself, which is Nietzsche's starting point. So how do you get from there to, or maybe you don't say that consciousness underlies everything? I mean, there's a lot of talk about that these days, like with Bernardo Kastrup and his idea of cosmic idealism. But is that the direction you go, or is it something else?
Well, I have this as an option in my current understanding of metaphysics, but that's mostly because my reason for adhering to Schopenhauer's view does lie in how I think metaphysical inquiry should generally work, or how I am, or have an intuition to how I believe it works, right? Which is that we can grasp the nature of reality, or how reality inherently works, by partly by introspection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for Schopenhauer, when we do this, what we encounter is will, right? That's what's fundamental to reality, this mindless, irrational, directionless impulse.
Exactly. Right.
And so with this general idea of metaphysics in mind, right? Working within the framework of looking inward, right? I could see myself holding to this framework, right? And instead of saying, when we look inwards and we introspect, we can conclude that the fundamental aspect of reality, or what fundamentally is real, is will, right? I could see myself possibly thinking over this more and saying, okay, maybe what is fundamental is self-consciousness, right? Or sort of dialect along the lines of the other German idealists. And so my framework in which I feel most comfortable now working within, and I think is most likely to be correct in the results it yields, currently points me towards Schopenhauer, and I think it will for a while. But I could see how that could change. So yeah, that's where I am with will versus the other mental aspects of reality being fundamental.
This touches on a question that Three Rusty Nails has been asking here. It's a huge question that I'm sure neither of us can answer. What is the cause of consciousness? Is being enough to explain the cause of consciousness? I'll address that, but do you have any ideas first that you would like to say to that? I mean, what is consciousness? Where does it come from? What causes it?
Well, I think this is an interesting question, and I think there are two ways that I can look at it. And the first way, which is I could look at it through my Schopenhauerian perspective and say, okay, where does will come from? What is will?
Mhm.
And from this, immediately, if I'm being faithful to Schopenhauer's thinking, I would say, well, this assumes the reality of causality beyond what we can consider, right? We're applying the principle of sufficient reason in a way that we can't. Right, to say that will needs a cause or we need to explain this ontologically is beyond what we can do, and it extends beyond our cognitive faculties in regards to epistemology. But I think the more interesting way to look at it, and this is something that has made me think for a while, is that what is the origin of our uniquely human consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I would obviously there are different ways to read Schopenhauer, but at least from what I can gather, I would say that there is a distinction between everything that we experience personally and what is only will. That there's a bit of a discrepancy there, right? To where we
Mm-hmm.
cannot simply identify the will that underlies all of reality with everything that we go through phenomenologically. And so I think accounting for this discrepancy, right, how beings such as ourselves could have the myriad of experiences that we do under a world that is simply will and our representation of it, I think that's an interesting question. And I think this is something that is really interesting when it comes up in pretty much all sort of transcendental idealism. So to the first one, I'd appeal to sort of Schopenhauer's view of epistemology, the principle of sufficient reason, and kind of discard the question itself. But towards the second one, I'm open. I'm not exactly sure how I'd answer that, but I'm interested to see what you have to say on this topic.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't know the answer to it. By the way, Three Rusty Nails, feel free to join back in comments or more questions because this is it's a huge question, one of central interest and one that nobody can answer right now. I think that I mean there are a couple ways to look at consciousness. It seems to be emergent from life. It's a part of life. Consciousness starts not as reason, but as feeling. Um, you move toward the good, you move away toward the bad, and you feel that emotionally. You can see it in an amoeba. And it emerges in more complicated states through evolution. We are at a position now where we can actually think about those feelings, but consciousness, I believe, is inherent in life. Now, what it is, I think, yeah, I will get to the Heidegger part, yes, but I just want to get to I want to get through the physics part first. I think that quantum mind theory will ultimately explain quite a bit. Um, there are two things in the universe that appear totally free of causality, and that's quantum fields and the quantum realm and our thinking. And I think they're both quantum. Uh, I, to me, the most interesting theory on that I have seen is Penrose's or um, where we're in entangled in the universe just like everything else. We're entangled beings. And that's how consciousness develops. We entangle with something else, another quantum being in the universe, and that creates a bit of consciousness. And on that initial bit of consciousness, this is the reduction part in the theory, is when that happens, that's when what we think of now as the wave function appears to collapse at that moment that we entangle with it. And there's some reason to think that entanglement is, in fact, what causes what appears to us to be wave collapse, but it's a reduction. It's the first reduction of reality so that we can grab onto some aspect of it. And then when reason comes along much later, that's the second reduction so that we can have practical interaction with our environment. But it's a reduction that takes place at that quantum entanglement. Now, that's from an ontic perspective, and I think there's something to that. But being an ontic or scientific reductionist explanation, it's the surface. And Rusty Nails is asking about Heidegger, which is, L. Spartan has joined us again. Have you regained human form, sir? Have you regained human form?
Possibly.
Yes. We were terribly concerned. I wasn't sure if you had turned into a monstrous being or if you had been abducted or what. I want to come back to your introduction in just a minute, but I was right in the middle of answering a question. For Heidegger, being explains everything. Being is what exists in its entirety, which we'll never know, and contains the essence of everything. It also contains some intentionality and the ability to experience itself appears to be part of the intention, and we are the latest. Our consciousness is the latest step in that ability for being to be aware of itself, to experience itself, to play as as being, to join in the play, to experience it. Along with consciousness is, and we'll get to this when we get to the epistemology, two ways of knowing the world. One is the primordial aesthetic, and that's what Heidegger would see as the authentic, the poetic, the musical, the aesthetic experience of the world, which is the dance of the world. And then there's the practical, which developed later, and most likely on the savannah, when we were needing to evade our much stronger prey, our much stronger predators, and capture those tricky prey. We developed more along the lines of a rational thought that further reduced the world to simple icons, but allowed us to manipulate the things that were of most immediate importance to us and do some sort of anticipation or planning. And those are modes of consciousness, but I believe it starts with the aesthetic experience of being itself. Rusty Nails, please feel free to comment or ask further questions. L. Spartan, are you still with us?
I believe so.
Yes, and in human form. That's fantastic. We've already done our introductions. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so as I think Jeffrey was talking, or as Youth Resist was talking about, I kind of like switched. So I switched. I was a Christian, and I went into like an atheist phase, and I kind of then
phase?
What?
You went through an atheist phase? I don't remember that.
Well, that was before we actually started talking, and then
back then,
I I went back and I was a Christian again, and then I was like, and now I'm in like this deist agnostic phase where it's hard for me to describe because emotionally I'm a Christian, right? I go to church. I have a lot of Christian friends. My parents are Christian. I read the Bible. I do a lot of that stuff. Sometimes I pray, but intellectually, I'm a deist slash agnostic. Like, I don't think you can rationally and evidentially prove Christianity or really argue for it because I think there's issues. So I think for me, I'm just like right in the middle.
Mhm.
I lean more naturalist. I'm with Chris. I'm actually almost exactly at Chris's spot in terms of like um, in terms of naturalism. I don't hold to a strict naturalism. I'm just like I'm a weird definition of naturalism, but yeah, I'm just in the middle.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, somebody is feeding back. Uh, do,
I
do,
gotta.
do you believe that there is something beyond this physical world, not necessarily, you know, our objectification of this physical world? We know that we understand the tiniest little sliver of reality, but reality is still there. It's physical. Do you, in your deism, think there is some metaphysical, otherworldly ground to things, or do you believe that more of a there is some meta? I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Oh no, sorry, that was your audio echoing through my mic. That was
I see. I see.
yeah.
Are you more of a panentheist?
So it's hard to describe because as a deist, you can believe a lot of things. You can believe in a physical God that's just outside the bounds of Earth,
Hmm.
just kind of like floating somewhere in the universe. You can be a pantheist, meaning just like the universe is the embodiment of God or is God or however you.
Isn't
Right. Like
pan,
Spinoza or Einstein thought.
isn't although JC, isn't there a distinction between pantheism and pandeism? Because
Yeah.
I've been somebody like Spinoza as a pantheist, but isn't pandeism something akin to the notion that God died or went through a transformation and became the material universe? Is that correct? Because I find this idea very intriguing, but also a bit off the
So
wall.
I'm not a pandeist, so I'm not 100% read up on this, but I think in terms of the differences is pandeism, it's in pantheism there's like somewhat of a personal aspect to it. Pandeism there's not. Like the deism in pandeism could just be like a spirit of some kind that has absolutely no clue that we even exist or something like that. So I would say there's just like a distinguishment between there's a personal factor that distinguishes it. Though I have a friend who would be a lot better at explaining this because he actually is a pandeist, but it's weird. But yeah, going back to Jeffrey's original question, there's a lot of different versions. For me personally, I'm an idealist, as you know. I don't always. I'm terrible at explaining it, as you saw, but um, I'm an idealist. So I think there is a consciousness beyond ours. So I think that there's a consciousness that kind of grounds the objectivity of our experience. And I don't think it's personal. I don't like. It's hard to say, which is where the agnostic part of me comes in. I just don't really know, but I think that's more my position. Is there's just some consciousness beyond ours that kind of grounds everything.
How do you make that leap to consciousness? I certainly would agree there's a ground, and we'll get to that in a bit about where I see that coming from, and that's more that Heideggerian aspect or even Nietzschean aspect. But how do you make the jump to consciousness?
So I didn't 100 like I didn't take on idealism and then just automatically jump to deism. Be like, oh, see, there has to be a ground. I come through it for like I accept some of the arguments for God. such as I can kind of get along with the Kalam somewhat. I just don't think it, I don't see a personal God. I don't accept like the second stage of it.
Mhm.
So there are other arguments along with that I accept and kind of work off of too. But ultimately, I think as an idealist, there has to be some objective consciousness that kind of, I don't know, all of our experiences are then it's hard to explain, but like all of our experiences are set in this one being or whatever you call it,
Right.
realities, a mind. And so it's kind of weird. I'm an agnostic. I'm like, I don't really know. That's just my best guess. That's
Right. Well, it's always good to stop with I don't really know because there's so much we can't know. Um, Chris, did you have a response to that at all?
I would be interested in talking about this because I think that here is where it gets interesting in how we would cash out this view specifically, right? Because I could see like with a bit different terminology how this could either flip from panentheism to absolute idealism, right? Because on one hand,
right.
I see this view that there's a sort of absolute consciousness, which is a mere awareness or what it's like to be-ness, foundationally a reality. And we are sort of certain persons within this ultimate consciousness, right? We are divisions of it,
Okay.
right? And fundamentally, there is this absolute of which there are certain parts, right? And these parts are essentially what compose reality. I'm not articulating specifically how I wish I could, but sort of along the lines of a British idealist like McTaggart, right? There's a plurality of persons, right? A sort of ontologically fundamental community of perceivers and the perceived, and these are what we consider the absolute, right? And on the other hand, I could see this easily going the other way and being some sort of panentheism, right? Where there's this ultimate consciousness that grounds everything, right? But in some way, it's also partly the universe, right? It is the universe, as in we are
Right.
identified with it, yet it transcends us. So either way, I could see this being a more naturalistic, absolute idealism with a bit of metaphysical spookiness in there, or just straight up a form of theism or pantheism.
Oh yeah, I agree with you there. And this is why I always have to be careful explaining my view because it's hard for me to put my thoughts into words, and so then I can really screw it up. Um, I agree with Chris. I would like to flesh this out more, sometime, maybe with him on Discord or some other time. But I think ultimately, I just don't know. I guess that's basically
There's
it.
nothing wrong with saying that. I don't know anything either. I want to get back to this in just 1 second, but Three Rusty Nails has another question here. I just want to get to real quickly. Um, it's first of all, he says, is the universe considered a conscious entanglement? It depends on by whom. There are people like there are some, especially multi-world people like Carol, who have proposed that everything is conscious and that entangle it, and for that reason, it can entangle. I don't know that that's true. I don't necessarily follow that. Here's our problem. We don't know. Every single entanglement that we can know of involves consciousness. We entangle with the machinery that makes the measurement. We entangle with it just like anything else. So every single instance of entanglement we can know of is attached to consciousness and perhaps caused by consciousness or consciousness, as Penrose says, is created by that entanglement. It certainly could be that things entangle without consciousness. We just are in a position where we can never know that. So I don't know. My guess is that consciousness only exists in living things, and to varying degrees of complexity. Um, what are absolutes? How do you determine them? I don't know that there are any absolutes. Could you ask that maybe in a different way? Because I'm not sure what you're asking. but as far as I know, I don't know of any absolutes, so I don't know. Did you any of you want to respond to Three Rusty Nails before I go into what my view on that?
On the absolutes, I'm guessing that because I think this is a vague term, right? I could, it's sort of, I'd put it up there with some of the terms that I've heard some theists use to predicate of God, right? Because when we use the term absolute, I don't think much is denoted by that term, right? However, I think the one of the contexts where it is intelligible and it does make sense is in regards to idealism, right? Where I think an absolute idealist could differentiate himself from a pluralistic idealist, right? By saying that there is an absolute consciousness that subsumes all others, right? Which would be in which would be separated from a different idealist that might say it is merely the ocean of human consciousness, these individual persons that are fundamental, right? That rather than different individual perceivers, that there's an absolute consciousness that subsumes them all. And when I say absolute idealism or an absolute consciousness, I'm referring to it in this sense. However, absolutes in general, I'm pretty sure that Three Rusty Nails was referring to absolute specifically in this context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's how I'd cash it out, and that's how I will be using it when I talk about it here. Just ways of distinguishing between the view that mind is fundamental. So, yeah.
Okay. Before I go into my response on the prior thing we were discussing, I think I could correctly say that the three of us, the one thing we have in common is we're looking for a grounding things, right?
Yeah,
For sure.
And it's the difference might be where we think that ground might be, where we're looking. Um, and I, I come out of the Schopenhauer to Nietzsche to Heidegger tradition, and mostly focused on Heidegger. And that that tradition, it it plays off of the two major trends in thought since the Enlightenment. One of them was the gradual and then sudden elimination of metaphysics, and the other was the elevation of aesthetic knowledge over rational knowledge. Um, and that means where I look is in the physical and assume nothing beyond the physical. I have no reason to think there is anything beyond the physical, but there's plenty more mystery in the physical than I can ever fathom, so I don't need to go outside. Um, and I firmly believe that it is that aesthetic knowledge gives us our most profound experience, and through that experience, realization of being as the ground of things. So that, science can tell us a lot, and it can also hint at the far more that we can't know. Let me go back into the Heideggerian explanation of this. There's the ontic technological, which is in a sense metaphysical understanding of the world, and that's the scientific technological understanding, and it can tell you things that are correct. We can measure things. We can gauge relations between things, and those determinations are correct. They tell us a little bit about the reality. They don't tell us what anything is or how anything is. It's a very superficial understanding, and it obliterates being from that understanding, and that's the general problem with technology or scientific reductionism is it obliterates being, which is in fact the ground of everything. There's an essence to the universe, and it's the mystery. Both Heidegger and Wittgenstein both talk about das Mystische. You know, it can be the mystical, but it's also the mystery that draws all real thinkers. It draws physicists as much as it draws poets and artists and musicians. It draws everybody. You look at the sky and it's a mystery. The more we learn, the more mysterious the universe is. We still don't, and probably never will, have an adequate interpretation of quantum mechanics. We can't. It's a mystery. It goes beyond our simple adaptive cognitive categories. Um, but there is a way of experience being that's unmediated and non-reductive, and that's aesthetic. And as I've said a million times before, there is much more profound wisdom and knowledge of the essence of the universe and our place in it, which is the ultimate question. The universe and our place in it. You want to know about that? Listen to a Beethoven symphony. There's far more profound wisdom in that than there is in both volumes of by Einstein of relativity. It's the same thing for the great poetry. And Heidegger goes on and on about, you know, the profound knowledge and the unmediated, unreducted experience of being that's possible through poetry. Nietzsche did it more through music, but they're talking about the same thing. There is a ground for everything. There's a ground for our essence. There's a ground for morality. There's a ground for our place in this world if we listen and don't distort it through metaphysics. And that's where I differ with idealism, because that will get us into metaphysics. And the one thing that, other than the mystic, that both Heidegger and Wittgenstein agreed with is be silent before that which you cannot speak. And that is the unreduced mystery of being. They differ, and this is why I go with Heidegger. Heidegger says, though, that there is a possibility of continuous revelation of being if we listen carefully, don't distort it with metaphysics, and just let poetry speak through us. It's almost as if being wants to speak through man, through language. That's the point of language. And a true artist, the poetry or the art denies his name because he's got nothing to do with it. It's just simply he's the conduit for being. Heidegger talks about that through moods. And the German word for that is Stimmung. And it's a great word because it doesn't just mean mood. It means voicings. Literally means voicings, so that the artist becomes like the resonant voicings of being as being sounds the strings inside. That's how we know being. That's where the essence is. So if we want to know morality, we'll never, Kant was wrong. It's got nothing to do with reason. You won't get there through a syllogism. You won't get there through the law of non-contradiction. It's much messier than that. You get to it through our inner sense of morality and listening to what being tells us about that. And I believe, when we talk about intentionality, you see an arc of progress in morality. What was considered perfectly right and moral 3,000 years ago, much of that we now consider utterly repugnant and illegal. We are moving in a general direction of tolerance of individual differences, freedom of thought, accepting of outgroups. We're moving toward a more pacifist, more open, and we've got a long way to go, but we no longer condone genocide, slavery, taking of the women of the conquered countries. We don't do that anymore for the largest degree, we don't do that anymore. At least it's considered wrong. There's a move in that general direction, and that's how I infer intentionality. Back to the metaphysics of technology or any kind of idealism, and I've talked about this probably in every one of these discussions, is in Heidegger's the question of technology. He pinpoints the modern era as when we went from thinking A is A, which is how the pre-Socratics basically saw the world. A is A, and that is not a copula. It is the most active of all verbs. It is as being. We went from that, and that's where being is. It inheres in that word is. We went from A is A to A equals A. And when we've done that, we've reduced the world to concepts, empty concepts, and we've displaced being from that is to some metaphysical realm. And that's the genesis of scientific reductionism, or the technological framework. Gestalt is what Heidegger calls it. And for that reason, I limit my inquiry to what can be revealed to me in this world aesthetically. That, I think, is where answers come from. I look to art, not analytic philosophy and theories, or even science, although anybody who knows me knows I have a huge interest in physics, but mostly for what it can tell me about what I can't know. So that's really my response. You guys go on, because I've gone on too long.
I have, well, I'm going to run to the restroom after I do this, but I have 3 questions I'd like to ask you. And obviously, once I'm back, I'll elaborate on it more, because I think there's a lot of interesting things here. But 3 questions that I want to ask quickly is the first one that I thought was interesting is the way that you talked about science and how we discover things through it, and how that compares to being and our understanding of being as being, right?
Mm-hmm.
What it means to be and what being is, what is the grounding of our universe, as opposed to science, right? You kind of drew this line between structural relations, right? Structural properties that we can discover through science.
Mm-hmm.
And we say that you said that we look at this through science. This is what we can realize. However, solely from this perspective, we eliminate or obliterate the concept of being.
Yes, exactly.
And so it is beyond this, and as you seem to say, through aesthetic knowledge that we start to understand what being is, right? And separate from the scientific inquiry, which I believe you categorized as technological or ontic. That's where we find these structural relations, this thing you said, superficial understanding of what reality is,
right?
But then we look to aesthetics for our understanding, our grasping of being, right? And so I think this is interesting because aside from your from what you said about aesthetics, I think what you said about scientific inquiry versus metaphysics is pretty much it's almost indistinguishable from what I believe a Thomist or an Aristotelian would say about science versus metaphysics, right? And so I wanted to know your thoughts.
That's an excellent question.
Yeah, on how you have such wildly different perspectives on what being is, right? And whether we can do any metaphysics at all. And yet how you understand science and its relation to existence seems to be very, very similar, right? So where would you say you diverge from the Thomist or the Aristotelian?
That is such an insightful question. Go take care of your business. When you come back, I'll tell you.
Sounds good.
And in the meantime, I'll address rusty nails. Okay, so Socrates and Aristotle got to their conclusions through syllogism and other logical systems. Yes, they did. They were the originators, basically, of A equals A, and obliterating being in this world. This is especially Socrates or Plato. obliterating being in this world and putting it into a metaphysical ideal realm where that was the real reality. That's the real being. And we only know its, some vague understanding of its shadows and forms. Um, Whereas Heidegger gets to it, he's looking for the essence of being in not through syllogisms, because being has been removed from there. You go to the syllogism and being is gone. It's moved off to some ideal realm. He's looking in this physical universe. He's going back to the pre-Socratics, people like Pythagoras, or Heraclides, who were trying to sense aesthetically what the world was telling them, what the world was like, so how it was revealing itself through music or through poetry, which those are, from the philosophical point of view, those seem to be the two major um, uh, uh, roads to some sort of unmediated, although art would have to be in there also, some unmediated experience. You learn through experience, not through deduction, is probably the shortest way of saying that. Um, Spartan, anything you want to add to this?
So I'm gonna be completely honest and say I only understood about 50% of what you said.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna be the new guy, dum dum here.
Okay.
But I think I agree with most of what you said. But I think I'd take this from more an emotional standpoint.
Okay.
Someone who's really deep into metaphysics, they may be some of the like I know some people who are super deep into metaphysics, Chris being one of them, are super intelligent people. But I think the way we understand the world eventually comes down to that knowledge that we can't necessarily totally reduce to metaphysics. I think music, art, culture, the way we experience everything emotionally is eventually the best understanding of the world. So
Right.
I think it's kind of hard to explain, but metaphysics, while may be important, may be fun to think about, good to argue about, eventually each person's decisions come down to how they experience everything through that aesthetic knowledge, just how they experience being. Like eventually everyone's knowledge pretty much comes down to that is basically what I gathered from it.
Yeah, well, then you understood a good deal more than 50%. That was a very good summation of it. Um, Getting to Chris's question, the differences in where we look. Um, the Thomists, all the metaphysicians are looking outside the physical world, and they're coming in doing that they obliterate being, but they also fall into a kind of cause transcendental illusion. They're talking about things they can't possibly experience or know, and it becomes mere metaphysical conjecture that can never be known. I mean, just that, the one, like I said before, the one thing Wittgenstein and Heidegger agree on is stop talking when you have no words. Um, and the fault of metaphysics is it keeps talking. Um, and once it keeps talking beyond the experience, it's really just fiction. It's nothing to take seriously, and it leads to all kinds of error. Um, Wittgenstein talked about helping the flies out of the bottles. He concluded, I mean, he completely reversed course from the original Tractatus and said the world cannot be understood as logical rules or logical, or propositional logic. That's not what the word is at all. And the last 2,500 years of philosophy has been a metaphysical error and linguistic errors, and it's over. Philosophy's done. The only role of the philosopher now is to untangle all those errors, which his metaphor was help the flies back out of the bottles. And I agree with that completely, which is why I don't go into metaphysics. First of all, it's talking. I would be saying things I couldn't possibly know, couldn't possibly experience. I resolutely adhere to experience. That's the only thing I can know. We live emotionally, we live experientially. Reason is added on top of that because it's extremely practical and helpful to. It's a very useful adaptation, and I certainly would not want to do without reason. It's got its place, and it's a critically important place for our survival, but it tells us nothing about the real truth of reality, and that's an important thing to do also. Going back to Heidegger, he wrote an essay, Wozu dichten, dortiger Zeit. It was what are poets for in time of need? And we are in a time of need. We're in the period where Nietzsche announced the death of God, along with the death of metaphysics, which puts us in this period of vertigo. Okay, how do we replace that? We got to ground ourselves someplace. Uh-oh. Chris, you still with us?
Yeah. In a few minutes, I'll have to head out.
Okay, well, we'll wrap this up pretty quickly. Okay.
And it doesn't. I'm not sure if you'll be able to pick up after about like maybe 15 minutes because either we can start wrapping up the stream here, or we can pick it up in a bit. Well, whatever works for you best. Mm-hmm. But go ahead for now. I want to.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm trying to remember what my last thought was. I'm getting old. I'm gonna be 69 next month, and I still feel like I'm 18. I haven't grown up.
Sorry.
Yeah. No. Please go ahead. Maybe I'll remember what I was saying.
I was just gonna say that it's really interesting. I think this conversation has made me start to think that in a way, when I was in the Aristotelian tradition, I viewed my epistemology and way of looking at the world is diametrically opposed to that of the analytic philosopher, right? Mm-hmm. And now that I'm more interested in the, I don't know how to broadly characterize it, but generally like the thinkers that we've been looking at, right? The German idealists, partly Heidegger, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. I guess this could be called the more continental tradition, but I don't like.
I need to interject though. There was nothing of idealism in Nietzsche or Heidegger.
Oh, absolutely. I just when I use the term idealist, I'm not referring to what would be either an analytic idealist or a Berkeleyan idealist, but just in any idea or way of viewing the world in which mostly transcendental idealists, but generally this other brand of philosopher or thinker, now that I've explored them more and they have opened up to me more, right, my understanding of them, I'm starting to see that the Aristotelian or metaphysical tradition is far closer to the scientistic.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Or analytic. Well, I don't like to say
reductionist, but it's reductionist, yes.
Right. But there's so much more in common there than I initially believed, right? Because there's, I think, possibly the broadest difference in different ways of looking at the world and philosophy and epistemology is the idea that the entirety of being, of what is, can come under the scrutiny of reason, of syllogisms, is something that the Aristotelian or the Thomist, the hardcore anti-reductionist, shares with the reductionist. They both believe that through our cognitive faculties, we can come to understand what the human person is fundamentally, what the fundamental stuff of reality is, whether God exists.
Mhm.
All of these things can come under the scrutiny of our reasoning, according to that tradition. And so I'm starting to, it's been interesting to kind of think about how, despite some of the differences, which of course there are between the reductionists and the non-reductionists, in the way of understanding the world, they do reduce quite a bit of the inherent mystery and incomprehensibility of being, right? And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's something that's obscured a lot in a lot of discourse now,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
nowadays it's mostly, well, when the Aristotelians do come into the picture, we see this huge dichotomy, or as it's posed to us, between people who are not reductionists, right, who are possibly emergentists, right? They believed a sort of dualism of the mind, right? And we put them absolutely left field compared to a materialist or reductionist, right? When in reality, when you really look at their thinking, of their way of understanding the world, there's barely any difference there. One of them simply finds one syllogism more convincing than the other. But when it comes to fundamental distinctions between worldviews,
Oh yeah,
not
you're
a
absolutely right.
concern. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it makes me less sympathetic to the Aristotelian side, seeing how close it could fall into the reductionistic error.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, for sure.
Uh, Chris, let me ask you a personal question. How old are you?
I'm 15.
How the hell did you get that smart at 15?
I'm really dumb, so he's
No, JC is smart too, for sure. But
No,
I
no,
just
both of you are astoundingly perceptive here. I'm stunned. You know, when I was 15, I was playing guitar in a band and chasing every girl I could find.
don't get me wrong, I still do that,
I was
but
about to say, when I am not contemplating philosophy, I also do those things. But
Actually, it was at 15 that I first read Nietzsche and Teilhard de Chardin. I just didn't tell anybody about it.
yeah, but no, I think these discussions are interesting to have, partially because not only are we ideologically distinct, but also in a lot of other perspectives, right?
Right.
You've obviously been invested in philosophy far longer than I have, and I've only gotten into it recently. We come from very different life perspectives too, and no, but yeah, I think that number one, I'm really glad that I that I signed on to have this discussion, because I believe it's been really valuable. Because prior to coming into this, I knew almost nothing of Heidegger. Right, he was one of the few well-known philosophers who I knew scant about, and like hearing this, I feel like I could write a dissertation on him. But
In my opinion, if you want to understand 20th century thought, and I think everybody ought to, the three people you need to come to terms with are Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Eugene Wigner, who was a physicist, a mathematical physicist, but was really a philosopher too. Um, those three people are critical to understand where we came from and where we're going. Um, Mr. Spartan, do you have anything to add? We're just about at our hour here, and we'll be breaking soon. But do you have any final thing you would like to add here?
yeah, I enjoyed it. I just had one question for Jeffrey, and you can answer it like super easily. Do you think, going back to like the aesthetic knowledge and stuff like that, do you think it is more reasonable for a person to come to the belief in God through culture, music, art, beauty of nature, that type of thing, than through some type of metaphysical syllogism, as your apologist would bring up?
Why do you guys ask so much better questions than people twice your age? Yes, absolutely. That is true. I don't know if you guys have read Kierkegaard. He is the most honest of Christian philosophers, and he basically he said there are several modes of life that you can follow, and you have to pick just one. And
Oh,
that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris. Did you say?
I was just I just had a moment where I just kind of remembered reading a bit about Kierkegaard. I think it
Yeah,
was I remember there was one that was the religious life,
right,
and I
exactly.
have
And right.
yeah I have either or, but I haven't dug into it yet. But I think
Read
it's very
Kierkegaard. It's very much worth it. If I were a Christian, I mean, what he said is he was religious. He was a Christian, and he said there is nothing rational in religion. This mode, this path of life, this type of life, is. I've got a brand new puppy who is demanding my attention. A 6-month-old boxer I rescued.
Aw.
And he's the sweetest dog, but he needs tons of attention. And he almost knocked over my light here just to get some. Anyway, what he said is, if you're going to be a Christian, that's your road. You don't go into the rational mode of life that's foreign to you. Embrace the irrationality, embrace the mysticism. Were I still a Christian and I were trying to um, convert, Kierkegaard said the worst mistake in Christianity was medieval scholasticism and the logical arguments, proofs of God. He goes, it's total nonsense. It's self-defeating. Embrace the irrationality, embrace the aesthetics of religion, and that's exactly what I would do.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of people get too caught up, oh well, I believe in God because of, beauty, the beauty of nature. They'll give a lot of reasons. And this used to be me a while back. Your first response is, as someone who's read a lot of philosophy, is, oh well, that's an appeal to incredulity. That doesn't really give you any evidence. But the more you really look at it, I think that's one of the best evidences. I think
I agree. I mean,
yeah for
if
sure.
there's a path to Christianity or any religion, that would be it, as long as you adhere within the physical. Um, when I was in graduate school, I've talked about this a million times too, but I had a professor named Paul Ricoeur, who is a French philosopher who's also a Christian. And he's very much in the continental tradition. He lives in France. He only came to the University of Chicago 1/4 of a year. Um, but he would talk about how in Europe, in the continent, not England, but the real philosophers on the continent, um, the Christians and the theologians, they don't really have apologists. They've got more serious theologians, are all, highly interested in Nietzsche and Heidegger because they ask the same questions theologians ask. They just look for the grounding in the physical world rather than a metaphysical God, um, which I thought, that pretty well sums it up right there. But either way, you've got to get it through the aesthetic. You cannot reason your way to a God. You might be able to interpret being that way, but you can't reason your way to one. That just
Yeah,
doesn't
and I
work.
think that's one thing Christians might have right, at least most Christians, when they say that, like my dad's always telling me when I first got into this, is that I can't reason my way to God. And at first I was like, "Pff, what do you mean? That's stupid. Yes, I can. If I rationally find evidence, then I'm gonna believe it, like why not? But the more I've kind of taken steps towards it, I've realized that you can't. You just can't do it. You're always gonna find
No,
some
it's
way to get
impossible.
around it.
Right. The only viable path forward is taking Kierkegaard's advice: embrace the irrationality, embrace the mysticism, embrace the aesthetic. Um, that would be the only way to go. I want to quickly address Amir, who has several comments here.
I
In just 1 second. So what I'm getting out of this, he says, is that Jeff is resonant with continental tradition. Yes, 100%. Um, I went to the University of Chicago undergrad and grad, which was difficult for a simple semi-literate biker to do. And the undergrad was 100% analytic, and I suffered through that for 4 years. I did extremely well and got accepted into the graduate program of Committee on Social Thought, where I never again had to deal with analytic philosophy, much to my joy. Yeah, I totally reject the analytic tradition. I think it's of no value at all. And I think it's interesting that of the originators of analytic philosophy, the only one who didn't later renounce it was Russell. Yeah, I'm definitely of the Continental, basically the Nietzsche to Heidegger tradition. And there are, for epistemology, there are things in Kant I rely on also. One more thing by Amir. If you're looking at aesthetics in the world and asking yourself questions pertaining to being, existence, and reality, how is that not one reasoning to God and or no God? I don't assume a God. I just assume being. That's what's here. That's our brute fact, the physical being of the universe. And all I am interested in is exploring the essence of that being. I am part of that essence, so I can explore it partially through. I want to know man's place in this world and what this world's about. And it doesn't necessarily entail a concept of God. I can find everything I'm looking for in physical being itself. That's all the mystery I need. It's far more than I can handle. We are over the hour at this point, and let me tell you guys, this has been my favorite conversation so far. I wish everybody was like you guys. Please come back.
Oh yeah, for sure. I would love to come on this channel again, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like there's a lot that I got out of it, but I also feel like we've only covered a tiny bit of area here, so I definitely enjoy doing this again. Because there's still some questions that I have, some things I want to discuss, and I might bring those up in DMs with you. But yeah, I had a great conversation.
Fantastic. And Mr. Spartan, if you can maintain yourself in human form, please come back.
Yeah. I got my mic situation figured out. So
Terrific. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll talk again soon. We'll talk about when we might be able to pick this conversation up again. Okay.
For sure. Sounds
All
good.
right. Thanks. Have a good night, guys.
Have a good night.